Hello, everyone. My name is Faith Macharia, and I'm a third-year graduate student in the Department of Anthropology and African American Studies. Welcome to today's event, and thank you, the Council of Middle Eastern Studies, for hosting this event. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Leslie Gross-Wyrtzen, who is a lecturer in the Department of African Studies and Middle Eastern Studies, and an affiliated faculty with the Department of Anthropology and the Center of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration at Yale. As a political geographer, her work focuses on the relationship between borders, race, and political economy between Africa and Europe. Her first book, the project Bordering Blackness, Race, Migration, and the Political Economy of Difference, was funded by the National Science Foundation, Fulbright-Hays, and fellowships at Yale. Her work also appeared or is forthcoming in Society and Space, the Journal of North African Studies, Security in Context, and a Journal of Critical Geography and Geoforum. So I'm excited to have her talk today. And so we'll start with Leslie speaking, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So please feel free to use the chat. So welcome, Leslie.
Great, thank you very much. It's kind of fun to have people in person too, but welcome to the, so welcome to everyone. Thanks for being here in person and on Zoom. I'm assuming you can hear me. If you can't, put something in the chat or in the Q&A. And just thank you, Faith Macharia, for the gracious introduction and willingness to facilitate this discussion today. And then obviously to the Council on Middle East Studies here at Yale, especially Marcia Inhorn, Kristen Siebert, Bish Saktivel, Lizzie Burke, and Marwa, of course, Marwa Khabor, who keeps everything running all the time, and we would be lost without her. So I also just want to say Ramadan Kareem to those who are celebrating today. And I'm really glad to have you join as well. So as Faith said, I'm a political geographer by training, and my work focuses broadly on the geopolitics of race between Africa and Europe, especially as it relates to transnational migration. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, which is a settler city that has been shaped by cross-border exchange, forced and voluntary migration and labor, and indigenous dispossession. After college, I worked as an English teacher and was in Morocco teaching on 9/11/2001. My first daughter was born in Meknes, just days before the May 2003 Casablanca bombings. Over the next decade of moving back and forth between the US and Morocco, I saw firsthand how in both places, border enforcement became increasingly securitized and immigration discourses became more explicitly racialized. In Morocco, immigration became a growth industry, not just for researchers like me, but for humanitarian workers, defense contractors, smugglers, and other people as well. So when I went back to study geography for my PhD, I decided to look at this relationship between race, borders, and political economy in Morocco to better understand what I had been seeing on the ground, but also to hopefully make sense of some of the things that I was observing at home as well. So I'm going to switch. I'm also seeing chat. Is that fine? Okay. All right. So I'm going to share the screen for a bit, and then I will probably turn it off. Okay. So the title for my talk today is Bordering Blackness, Race, Migration, and the Political Economy of Difference in the Mediterranean. And this is one of the working titles for my book project, which examines how Moroccan border enforcement as part of the larger Euro-African border that spans Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and much of Africa mobilizes race to control and profit from the movements of West and Central African migrants. And I draw on more than a year of ethnographic fieldwork among migrant communities in 2 Moroccan cities to examine how the border works and fails in these aims. So when I'm talking about borders, I'm not only or even primarily talking about walls and fences that are so fetishized in media and political rhetoric. But rather, when I talk about borders, I'm speaking about the processes of sorting people into categories that determine who moves freely, whose rights are respected, and whose lives are ultimately deemed valuable. And this process doesn't just limit borders to the edges of territory, such as checkpoints or militarized no-man land, but entails widespread practices and discourses that turn people into outsiders by virtue of their nationality, economic status, gender, religion, and as I argue here, their race. So what I'm really looking at here is the border's productive power, what borders make or do rather than what they limit. So for decades, border and migration scholars have argued that citizenship is defined by non-citizenship. And we see that now in Europe, where the Muslim other is mobilized by the far right to shore up visions of a white Christian European citizenry against post-colonial immigrants and Europeans alike. Scholars have also studied how borders produce transnational labor regimes in which poor women and men from the majority world are rendered undocumented and fungible labor, while wealthier workers, mostly from the minority world, are able to circulate freely as tourists, students, skilled workers, and so on. So I build on these insights by examining the power of borders to produce racialized others for the sake of constituting communities and nations, and also for enabling the exploitation of certain people's labor and their mobilities. But as a geographer whose formation was shaped by post-colonial and Black geographic thought, I'm especially interested in the spatial dimensions of these processes. How do borders produce and order space beyond just enclosing nation-state territory? How do they produce or shore up certain spatial imaginaries in which some people always belong and others are always outsiders? What sorts of policies, practices, and logics enable, for example, a white cisgendered woman with US citizenship to move with relative ease across national borders, through downtown shopping districts, and in elite universities? How do these policies, practices, and logics render people of color, especially poor people of color from the majority world, out of place in many of these same places? My research points to three findings, parts of which I'll revisit in the meat of this talk. So first, the Euro-African border mobilizes white European imaginaries and local, historically sedimented racial categories that contain and extract value from Black or African migrants in Morocco. Second, this racialized containment oscillates between fast violence of clashes at the border fences and slow violence of abandonment in urban informal spaces. And third, migrants draw upon these newly formed Black identities to form transnational communities grounded in place that enable their survival, mobility, and self-recuperation in violent borderscapes. So based on these findings, I argue that the Euro-African border is a world-making project, one that produces spaces and subjects of value and devaluation, humanity, and inhumanity through racial regimes of mobility and through violent expropriations. As West and Central African migrants travel from their homes toward Europe, they become Black, which is to say their illegality and out of placeness is read off their bodies. This racial displacement from spaces of belonging or from human geography writ large enables the growth of the border as a business and conditions the possibilities for new African diasporas and solidarities in the Black Mediterranean. This is consistent with Black geographic thought, which excavates the racial and sexual violence foundational to the production of space of modernity, while acknowledging the placemaking, survivance, and resistance that has always characterized the lives of those excluded from the ranks of capital M man. All right, we're back to the slides for a minute. So in Bordering Blackness, the book project, each chapter looks at a different space in the Euro-African border and how racial and economic logic shape efforts to control migrants' transnational movements. The first chapter zooms out to look at the border as a whole and how Morocco came to be included in it. And then in subsequent chapters, I look at other spaces in the border, the desert that many migrants have to pass through en route to North Africa and Europe, cities in Morocco's interior where migrants are abandoned after being detained by police, and destinations, which are not quite the spaces of arrival that migrants hope they'll be. So today, I'm not going to do all that. Instead, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Euro-African border as it came to be rooted in Morocco. And then I'll zoom in on one site within it, the Moroccan city. Cities in the Moroccan interior have become really important spaces within the border, especially after Morocco instituted humanitarian reforms in 2013 and 2014. And as we'll see, both the transnational expansion of the Euro-African border and its respatialization to Moroccan cities highlights how racialization is central to the border's operations, as well as the border's failures. So in 1998, the Austrian presidency of the European Council circulated a draft strategy which proposed a Europeanized policy that would harmonize individual states' border and immigration control, including processing of asylum. The need for a Europe-wide policy became increasingly clear through the 1990s as significant changes reworked the geopolitical landscape of Europe, including the establishment of the Schengen Free Movement Zone, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and new waves of migration from east to west, including refugees displaced from the wars in the former Yugoslav Republic. The 1998 strategy paper proposed a shift from a defensive Cold War era fortress Europe to a graduated plan organized in geographically concentric rings, each with different policy orientations toward the management of borders. The innermost two circles referred to EU member and candidate countries who were supposed to strengthen their border controls around Europe's outer territorial edge. The third circle, if I had a clicker, I guess I would point to it, but the third circle designated Europe's neighborhood, North African and Eastern Mediterranean states like Morocco and Turkey that not only sent large numbers of their own citizens, but were also zones of transit for other migrants and asylum seekers that were en route to Europe. Those third circle states didn't qualify for inclusion in the EU. Their border enforcement practices should align with EU objectives. And what this meant, according to the paper, is integrating Europe's neighbors in policing and information sharing about immigrants and inducing these third states to operate, quote, security nets and conduct spot checks unprompted by suspicion to prevent people from reaching Europe where they might claim asylum. And then the fourth and outermost circle was reserved for, quote, the Middle East, China, and Black Africa. Fourth circle states were expected to collect and share fingerprint data on, quote unquote, potential immigrants among their own populations and cooperate on the voluntary return of refugees. Finally, the paper advocated that European aid to third and fourth circle countries should be made conditional upon cooperation with the EU's border and migration objectives. So, like, as we can imagine, when leaked to the public, this paper caused considerable controversy. Nonetheless, when the European Council meeting in Tampere in October 1999 met, they adopted many of the policies and cartographies proposed in this 1998 paper, codifying a multi-level policy of border externalization that would use, quote, all competencies and instruments, unquote, at the EU's disposal, such as trade relations, development aid, and other fiscal incentives to ensure third state cooperation with EU foreign policy goals to reduce immigration and asylum pressure on Europe. So over the past 2 decades, EU spending on migration and bordering has skyrocketed from a budget line item around 1999 of a few €100,000 to a multi-billion-dollar expenditure that's spread out across multiple instruments and various agencies. The growth of the border expenditures created new economic opportunities for the security and defense industry, researchers like myself, and as migration got more difficult and dangerous for smugglers and humanitarian rescue workers. So Morocco is one of the earliest partners in the EU border project and remains one of the largest recipients of EU funding in the southern neighborhood. In the 1990s, Morocco was actively seeking closer economic and political ties with Europe, and cooperation on migration management became a vehicle for deepening those ties. After 9/11, as the EU's approach to border enforcement became securitized, Morocco began to cooperate with Spain to intercept clandestine boats crossing the Straits of Gibraltar and later in the Atlantic passage to the Canaries. Though Morocco's response to European pressure to strengthen its immigration laws was initially lukewarm, after the Gaza bombings in 2003, the Moroccan parliament passed a harsh law that criminalized unauthorized entry and exit from the country, punishable by fines and prison time. With EU assistance, it also increased its activities along the Mediterranean and Algerian borders and expanded its security and border personnel. So for me, a big question is, why would Morocco, a migration sending country in its own right, be such a willing partner in securing Europe's territory against outsiders? And I argue in the book that significant economic levers, such as facilitation of remittances, short-term visas for agricultural workers, favorable trade agreements, and investment in Morocco's border infrastructure all contribute to this cooperative environment. But Morocco is not Europe's policeman, as they've been called, but a savvy actor in its own right. Morocco juggles its partnership with Europe with its desire for closer ties to other African states. Morocco's pivot from Europe to Africa over the past decade or so is evidenced by its rejoining of the African Union, its continued refusal to sign various readmission agreements that allow Europe to deport West Africans to Morocco, and the granting of legal residency to thousands of undocumented West and Central African migrants in 2014 and 2017. So while Moroccan people are somewhat tolerated in urban areas in the country's interior, they continue to be violently repelled from fences at Melilla and Ceuta, or pushed back to Morocco from the Mediterranean. Through variations in policies and practices, Morocco navigates its commitments to containment while purportedly providing pathways to integration and welcome for its fellow Africans. I talk about this as a form of state entrepreneurship, whereby Morocco sells its cooperation for economic and political gain, most recently evidenced by the flip in Spain's position on Western Sahara. At the same time, Morocco's cooperation with EU imperatives to prevent transit migrants from reaching Europe also allows it to construct illegalized migration as an exogenous problem. As Moroccan scholar Mehdi Laflou points out, this is curious, given that, quote, if Morocco appears to be Africa's gateway to Europe, it's a gateway that until today has been used primarily by Moroccans, unquote. Despite this, in both European and Moroccan discourse, the specter of African migration is represented as a crisis and figured in the image of a Black migrant. This figure of African migration conceals the fact of Morocco's own Africanity and deflects from the anti-Arab and anti-Muslim rhetoric that is rife in European domestic politics. It also consolidates Morocco's role as a key partner in the Euro-African border. And you can see here on the left, is that your left? Yes, on the left is a weekly, I think it's a weekly in Morocco in 2012 that put out this very controversial cover. And so like some of the responses online were included this where someone just put the face of someone that looks like a Maghreban person and did Europe Hebdo to kind of point out Morocco's hypocrisy in this area. So the construction of migration as other to Moroccanness renders West and Central African migrants out of place throughout Moroccan social space, even as policies and practices of border and migration management vary from the frontier region of the north to cities in the interior. While Moroccan, Algerian, and even Syrian migrants may pass unmolested through checkpoints at the Morocco-Spanish border using a purchased passport or ID, West and Central African migrants are often detained before they get anywhere near this checkpoint, rounded up in nighttime raids on forest encampments or in broad daylight as they walk down the street in northern cities like Oujda or Tangier. So prior to 2014, Moroccan people rounded up in the north were often illegally deported to the desert border with Algeria, a practice that was widely condemned by Moroccan human rights advocates, migrants, and humanitarians in Europe. So in response, in late 2013, King Mohammed VI instituted a more humanitarian migration policy that led to the cessation of illegal deportations, but did not affect the violence that migrants experienced in encounters at the fence or at sea. Instead, phenotypically Black people were routinely detained and forcibly displaced to cities in the interior. And once in these cities, migrants were abandoned on city streets where the struggle for day-to-day survival made resuming the journey more difficult. Oh, sorry. The shift from desert deportations to forced displacement to urban areas after 2013 created a newly visible population of impoverished migrant people living in camps or begging on the street. This led to the perception of a growing problem of sub-Saharan migration among ordinary Moroccans, and consolidated Blackness as a marker of outsiderness regardless of legal status. And in other work, I look at how this affects Black Moroccans. So in the fall of 2017, tensions between locals and migrants erupted into violence after a rumor circulated that a West African man had harassed a Moroccan woman near the Oulad Zian bus station in Kaza. Dozens of Moroccan youth attacked a migrant encampment that was right outside of the bus station, which housed hundreds of West and Central African migrants, almost entirely men. The violence that followed lasted several days and resulted in the camp being demolished by fire, and dozens of migrant people were arrested, deported, or displaced to more remote southern cities. One Moroccan man in an online report told a reporter, "We're not against them, but nobody wants a dirty home. His Majesty doesn't want his home soiled. Yes, they're welcome, but they messed up the place. You can see for yourself, for God's sake. Does this look like a bus station entrance?" The abandonment and destitution of migrants on city spaces and city streets serves to compound this idea of outsiderness and construct them as a threat to the well-being and morality of Moroccan society, and effectively also prevents them from easily continuing on their journey. So while the camp might be the familiar or more familiar side of border enforcement, changes to the migration policy impacted other spaces in the city as well. As the journey to Europe became more difficult, expensive, and fragmented, some people moved to working class neighborhoods, such as the one located in the industrial quarter of Fez, which I'll hereafter refer to as the neighborhood. The neighborhood consists of densely compacted 2- and 3-story buildings divided into apartments. These flats are rented informally or through migrants or students who have papers. By day, it's pleasant, with narrow strips of flowers and olive trees planted along the walls of some of the buildings, interspersed with small shops or small stores or sandwich shops, and anchored by a large mosque with fruit stands arranged in front of it. At night, it's a bit more dangerous, and several people I know were mugged while I was doing research there. Muggings are pretty common in Moroccan big cities, but migrants make particularly easy targets because they're less likely to appeal to police, even when they know who the assailant is. For women, walking in the neighborhood has an added risk. Black migrant women are widely assumed to be sex workers, and women are routinely followed and propositioned by Moroccan men. The economic and physical vulnerability of women in the city and elsewhere in the border often leads women to attach themselves to a husband or a patron who can provide physical and sometimes economic security. All right, let's see, where did my thing go? Okay, I don't show slides of migrants, so I'm turning off my PowerPoint for the rest of the talk. So much of my fieldwork in Fez was spent in the neighborhood in a spacious apartment a couple blocks from a large cement factory. Lawrence, a Francophone Cameroonian man who rented the apartment, graciously allowed me to use the smaller of 2 living spaces for an English class I taught migrants twice a week. The larger salon functioned as a restaurant, bar, and hangout for men passing the time. During the day, there were usually only a few people around, smoking or watching Nollywood movies on the flat screen TV, while Lawrence's wife and toddler moved in and out of the main bedroom, and sex workers lounged in the small bedroom watching videos on their phone. Grace, Lena's mother, also joined the class when she wasn't busy preparing food, washing clothes by hand, or resting from the long hours of work at night when the bar opens up and the apartment fills with Nigerians, Cameroonians, Ivoirians, and other West and Central Africans in the neighborhood who are looking for a place to socialize. Like many of the migrant women I met in Morocco, Grace was really reserved around me for a few months, for good reason. But as we got to know each other, I learned more about her story, how Grace's father paid the smuggler outright for her passage to Morocco so she wouldn't be indebted to a Nigerian madam, how she had to hide from police in Tangier for several months because of crackdowns on Black people in the street, and how she eventually moved to Casa, where she first worked on a farm and then as a maid for a European woman. Those latter days were happy for her because for the first time in her life, she lived on her own and made her own money. If you'd seen me on the street, you wouldn't know me. I was like a European lady, she said, gesturing to her hair and clothes. She met Lawrence at a baby naming party a few months before she decided to try her luck getting to Europe via Libya. Once in Libya, though, she was kidnapped along with other migrants she traveled with and held hostage while they extorted her family back home for money. It was there in Libya she discovered she was pregnant with Lena. Lena was born shortly thereafter after she made it back to Morocco, and she and Lawrence moved in together. Now any money she made, she handed over to Lawrence, but she worked in the house, and she worked in the house like a maid she had been before, but now without pay. One day during class, we read an article about the negative effects of stress. This stirred something in Grace, and later she pulled me aside to talk about it. She told me how stressful life was now, especially because of Lena. She didn't want to stay in Morocco, but she couldn't leave either. To go to Europe with Lena meant taking an inflatable boat. She was terrified they would drown. She couldn't return to Nigeria because Lena could not get a laissez-passer to travel without Lawrence's signature. Grace's world had contracted to the apartment and the neighborhood, cleaning what was effectively a bar and raising a child in a place that in her eyes offered no chance of a better future. When I offered to investigate what it would take to get Lena into public preschool, she said she would never let her child learn Arabic because in Libya, quote, they say Allahu Akbar before they kill you. Like all the women I met during fieldwork in 2017 and 2018, Grace is still in Morocco 4 years later. The migration policy reforms in Morocco provided legal residency to many of these women, but its experience is abandonment rather than integration. For women like Grace, caring for children indebted to smugglers or stuck in patronage relationships with other migrants, life in the neighborhood is one of containment and immobility. But this isn't the case for everyone. I met Arnaud on my first visit to Lawrence's apartment. After parking next to an enormous pile of wood used to heat water for the neighborhood hammam, my research partner led me up a set of concrete stairs to a black metal door. We rang the bell several times and eventually it was opened by a short, round-faced man holding a ring of keys. My partner greeted him, introduced me as the teacher, and we squeezed past him into the narrow hallway. Arnaud relocked the door, pocketed the keys, and silently motioned for us to proceed to the main part of the apartment. As I returned to this apartment each week, I enjoyed Arnaud's gentle jokes and quiet conversation. He was 23 years old when I met him and arrived in Morocco the year before. Trained in accounting, he came from a family of educators. His mom's a teacher, his brother a philosophy professor, and one of his sisters teaches chemistry. He left Cameroon because of political instability between the Francophone and Anglophone regions, and also because of constricting economic opportunities that were coming out of that. He lived with Lawrence and Grace, who he called his father and mother, and helped take care of Lena, who he treated as a beloved little sister. Arnaud cleaned the house, manned the door at all hours, shared the smaller bedroom with other visitors, and helped Grace with the cooking and making gourou, which is a homemade alcohol named after the mountain where migrants camp before trying to climb the fence at Mlia. While I came to understand that Arnaud was indentured to Lawrence for facilitating his journey from Douala to Fez, Arnaud performed these tasks out of gratitude for Lawrence's help in getting him safely to Morocco. He didn't even have to spend any time in the north or try his luck on the fences. Upon arrival in Morocco, he went directly to Fez to stay with Lawrence, with the understanding that once he paid off his debt, Lawrence would provide contacts and money for a share in a Zodiac boat so he could make the final leg of the journey to Europe. So after a year of working in the bar, which is like kind of coincides with the end of my field work, Lawrence gave him his money and connected him to people in the north who would secure his passage. One day in early May, an unfamiliar teenage boy answered the door to Lawrence's apartment. I asked where Arnaud had gone, was told he was in the forest. He stayed in a clandestine camp in the mountains for a few weeks, eventually securing the spot on the boat heading out from a small beach near Nador. On May 17, 2018, I went to Lawrence's place to visit some friends and found men and women lounging all over the house, recovering from what had been an epic 2-day celebration in honor of Arnaud. After several hours at sea, his boat had been intercepted by Spanish Coast Guard and brought to the mainland. Lawrence shook his head in wonder, saying, so many people have tried many times. I myself had tried 8, 9 times, and Arnaud gets to Spain on his first try. I asked if he was frustrated about that, but Lawrence replied emphatically, no, anytime someone makes BOSA, which is success getting to Europe, it's a reason to celebrate. For Arnaud's part, speaking to him from a migration reception center in Spain, he told me, it's not easy in Morocco. It was not easy in Morocco, but with the aid of Lawrence and his wife, I faced difficulties and made it to Europe. Really, I will be infinitely grateful to them for my whole life. Long life to Lawrence and his wife. Arnaud's characterization of Lawrence not as his smuggler or debt holder, but helper and kinsman was repeated in similar form by many migrant people in Morocco. If the Euro-African border produces racialized subjects, whereby people of multiple religions, languages, and citizenships become unauthorized Black or African migrants, this same process forms the conditions of possibility whereby migrant people can manage the violence and constraints of the border collectively through relational networks of care, exploitation, and assistance. These networks constitute migrant moral economies that route people, money, and shared norms and practices from West Africa through the Sahara into North Africa and eventually across the Mediterranean Sea. At the base of these economies is not the rational logic of the market, but a socially held sense of justice related to pursuit of livelihood and the refusal to accept the legitimacy of a border regime that racializes, illegalizes, and devalues them. So this isn't to say the migrant moral economy is sufficient to counter the violence and intensity of the Euro-African border. Instead, it points to the limits of migrants' agency and the limits of the border's efficacy. Migrant moral economies are expressions of community emerging not only or even primarily from common roots, but through shared routes through a violent borderscape. In this way, I understand the migrant moral economy as an emerging African diaspora, and as such, as a site of new political and spatial imaginaries that disrupt dominant geographies. So if at the beginning of this talk, I argued that Bordering Blackness challenges narrow conceptions of borders, I also want to conclude by arguing that this book also offers something to our understanding of geography. The new spatial imaginaries engendered in the Euro-African border reorients the map of the Black Mediterranean, which is an analytical category that Cedric Robinson first used to capture the long history of movement and placemaking by Black people in the region. The Black Mediterranean has been taken up in productive ways by geographers, mostly working in Southern Europe. Bordering Blackness extends this analysis to the Mediterranean's African shores. By looking at border work that expands and connects Europe and Africa, the book offers a way to think relationally about anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist struggles as broadly transnational, transcontinental, and transtemporal. I think it also recuperates the global Southness of the Black internationalist vision that Cedric Robinson put forth when he first theorized the Black Mediterranean in decentering Euro or American accounts of race, identity, and politics. And I think I will end there.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for a very, very engaging talk. So feel free to put your comments or questions in the chat and I will look through them.
I can also raise their hand.
Oh yes, and for the audience here, please feel free to raise your hand and you'll get a chance to ask Leslie a question directly. And because there's nobody asking a question yet, I think I'll just go by first and say that I find this work super important first in looking at how race works in the continent. And I think this is a gap that is still really large and your work is really getting at filling this. And I thought your thinking about bordering practices and the displacement of Blackness and who gets to move within these borders, who gets to move freely. And you started with in the beginning, you were talking about tourists being able to come in, but also African migrants who are coming from the global South not being able to move upwards, move out. And I was curious about how you're thinking about the concept that you offered us of fast and slow violence within the context of bordering practices that are both creating new racial formations, but also solidifying other historically already there processes and the new ones that are coming forward.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Faith. I think, and it's actually like making me rethink some things in the sense that I think a lot about fast and slow violence as sort of the oscillation between the spectacle of bordering, right, at fences or at sea, like the drama of it that we see, and the way it marks people physically, like people physically encounter it, in really profound ways, with like the slower violence of like, I guess what border scholars would call like differential inclusion, and the ways that there's sort of a partiality to inclusion and exclusion that isn't just about keeping someone outside of a border, but once they're in a particular territory, they're still marked in some way as an outsider, as an included outsider. And I think that the example of providing regularization from the residency permits is where I see that slow violence kind of unfolding. So I got a residency permit in Morocco, and it really did enable me to work and research and do the things that I wanted to do. But the folks that I was with, even those who had residency permits, still were operating in this sort of liminal space between, integration and exclusion. And it has its own economic consequences, right? Like the ability to find a job, their constant feeling of temporariness. A US permit, like Morocco offers US citizens a 10-year permit. They offered people in these particular campaigns 1-year permits. So there's all sorts of ways of like creating these hierarchies of difference, I think, that then get experienced as violence. And the slow violence that I'm talking about really just has to do with exhaustion, with like constant, more subtle forms of bordering that people experience as they move throughout those sorts of spaces. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, okay. yes, it does. And so I'll move on to the 2 questions I see, and I'll start with you first.
Thank you for the talk. This concept of slow violence attracted a lot of my students last semester when we had that article. And are you exploring it more in the book? Is it because here there is a lot of solidarity also where they are? So how are you showing it? Will you be showing this slow violence in the book?
I'm actually, the chapter I'm writing right now, the final chapter that I'm writing, looks at sort of, I guess it kind of acts as it's actually from a song, Senegal Fast Food by Amadou and Miriam. And one of the lines in that song is, "Where is the border?" And that was really interesting to me. I was kind of rethinking it because it tells the story of, the music video is great, but it tells the story of this couple that falls in love in Dakar, and the young man decides he wants to go to Europe, probably like to make a living, right? So he could get married. And all the things that he encounters like along the way, all the struggles that he encounters along the way. But there's a line that says, "Where is the border?" And then another line that talks about the elevator to the ghetto. And in the final scene of the video, he finally arrived in Paris, and he's walking across a bridge, and he's like exhausted and worn down from this long struggle to get there. But you see him like just start to smile and relax a little bit, and he encounters police, French police, who ask him for his papers, which obviously he doesn't have. And the video ends with him about to try to run away and them about to respond with force. And I think like that made me think about how the border follows people, and sort of the fast and slow, and how both fast and slow violence follow people as well. It's not really one or the other necessarily. And that the slow violence side of that, part of that in Destination, articulates with or dovetails with theorizations that folks like Nick DeGeneva have had on deportability, where you're just constantly in this like tense state of facing the condition of possibly being deported. And that can extend for decades, right? Like it can be, especially in the US, there's no timeline after which you aren't going to be deported if you came without documents. So yeah, so I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I'm starting to think about how those things have long afterlives, I guess, even after you've arrived, and probably affect even second generation. So, and I'm thinking, I am co-authoring a piece right now with a former student whose research is on the US, on what I call the American border, like the whole corridor. And some of her interlocutors have lived in the US for 20, 30 years, and they still make decisions every day to avoid police and ICE, because they'll be deported and their children are US citizens. So yeah, so I'm thinking about that too. Did you have a question, Vish? Vish and then Lauren?
Yeah, I have kind of two separate questions, so you can, I don't know, choose which one or answer both you want. Firstly, I wanted to hear a bit more about your ethnographic process. I mean, you spoke a little bit about, kind of speaking with migrants at this kind of hostel, this place that they were kind of hanging out while they would wait to kind of cross. You spoke a little bit about positionality, and I wanted to hear a bit more about that, how that was kind of reconciled, how you were kind of met by people, how you were kind of perceived by people. And a second question I had, and I hope this is coherent, about the way that Morocco itself kind of conceives of its Africanness. There's this kind of dissonance between how the state kind of projects itself on the world stage and how the kind of self-image of the broader citizenry. You mentioned lately that, Morocco rejoined the AU for a number of reasons. Morocco for a long time was really oriented toward Europe and kind of wanted to be like the like Europe on the on the southern Mediterranean, and now it's orienting more towards Africa for a number of diplomatic reasons, including like the Western Sahara and things like this. But also there's also this kind of part of this kind of soft diplomacy has been to kind of pitch itself as this kind of African country, and in doing so, there's been this shift from kind of anti-Blackness to this sort of official state of philo-Blackness. And how does this kind of jive with the actual self-image of the broader Moroccan public, which is, without generalizing, kind of largely kind of anti-Black in its kind of outlooks and discourses.
Okay. Lauren, did you have a related question or want to just throw it out so I can?
It's not it's not necessarily related.
Oh, go ahead anyway. And then I'll just
I was curious about the Spanish cities that are kind of at the top of Morocco, and whether kind of their relationship to the surrounding area and what those border encounters look like there.
Yeah.
Who is working at those checkpoints, and like how are they connected to the community or not? Where do people come from? Like more kind of context about that.
Right. Okay, cool. All right. I'll start with the ethnography positionality. Yeah. So I had, by the time I started research, I had lived in Morocco for 5 years off and on and visited lots of summers. And so I already had some relationships on the ground, and actually through my church is how I met a lot of migrants and became aware of their plight. Really through like churches responding to people's emergency needs, like when they got dispossessed by, like where they were staying was raided and they were kicked out of their home by police, or when they were dropped off in the desert and then they needed money to get back. So that's kind of how I came to know a little bit more about that, about their situation. And when I went back to do research, what I really wanted to do, well, two things. One is I wanted to tell a story about the border. I didn't necessarily want to tell a story about migration, even though those are really bound up. Because I feel like what I'm interested in is structures of power and the ways that we can kind of, for lack of a better word, like resist those, right? But I did also understand that to really understand the extent of the border's operations, I probably needed to talk to the people who were targeted by it the most. So I started with some of the relationships that I already had, but I was also really looking for ways to kind of like give back or find some sort of reciprocal that doesn't sound that unevenly reciprocal relationship. And I'm trained as an English teacher. So one of the things I did was go to, and I had been volunteering at this listening center, and I heard all of these needs that migrant people had. And one of them came from this young man who was from Cote d'Ivoire, I believe, and he wanted to go back home. And there's a program for voluntary return that the IOM runs, but he couldn't go back home because his family had spent so much money to give him this opportunity, and they'd taken out loan, all of this stuff. And he was like, if I could just get some sort of education to show something for my journey, like formation, if I could get something like that, then I could go home and hold my head up. And so I was like, well, maybe that's something that I can do. So I started volunteering with a Migrant Ngo. So first I spoke to a really prestigious language school in Morocco, and they agreed to let me issue certificates of completion for these mini courses in English that I offered to folks. And for a lot of folks, that was their only documents that they possessed. So I started teaching these classes, which I think some people were really into the English part of it, and some people were really into the documentation part of it. And I did this with a Migrant NGO, and then I also did it in this more informal space as well. Little side note about that. One of my minors students eventually made it across the fences into one of the Spanish enclaves. And the picture that he took in the reception center, he's holding his English certificate because it was like his only documentation to prove who he was. But anyway, so that's something that I try to do, but as a foreigner, like migrants are overstudied in Morocco dramatically. And so I was really careful about the kinds of relationships that I formed. And I really focused on about 4 to 5 people throughout the book, who almost all of them I've sat down with at length and talked to them about their role in the book and gotten their feedback. One person didn't like that I condensed his 20-page story into 10 pages. So we're still negotiating that, but I tried to involve them in the process. And for a lot of them, they're really cynical about what this research will do in terms of their real practical lives. But they also have signed off on this really out of friendship in some ways. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say too, obviously my whiteness, my Americanness, all of that was sometimes created certain kinds of distances, but also was a resource for some folks. My car was a huge resource. I spent almost all of my research time driving people around, to the hospital, to the post office, to this, to that, sometimes just so people could show off, I just drove all the time. I feel like that's an article in and of itself. So that's kind of how I negotiate it. The last thing I will say is, well, 2 things. One, my ability to speak Arabic was really helpful. Another way that I could help, because I could communicate with government agents. But my age, I think, was one of the biggest advantages, because I think I just in some ways seemed a little bit less like a threat and maybe a little more maternal. And so it changed the nature of the relationship in ways that I wasn't expecting. So at least there's one benefit, I guess, to being of a certain age when you go in the field. And then in terms of Morocco's Africanity, I think there is that real tension, right? A lot of Moroccans told me, no, we're Africans, solidarity, right? But then, almost in the same breath, would reproduce really common categories about Africa as traditional, as not modern, as, various, undeveloped, those sorts of things. And I think of Morocco as sort of, between Africa and Europe. I think of it very similarly to the position of, of certain kind of migrants who are aspiring to whiteness or aspiring to citizenship or aspiring to some sort of belonging, and do that sometimes through the creation of distance, right, from other people. So I think Moroccans in general, often had a lot of sympathy for migrants. They also sometimes really identified with that Africanity, but they're also oriented toward where they saw opportunities, right? And I think both the Moroccan state and individual Moroccans have not given up Europe as one of those important spaces of opportunity, even as they're turning toward Africa. I should also, anyway, I'll leave it at that. If Nizar were still here, I think he could have more to say about that, but that's one of the ways I saw it working out. And then the Spanish enclaves, you know, historically, there's been a lot of back and forth between Melilla and Ceuta and the areas around it, and it's really changed because of the buildup of the border around there and the really militarization of that whole zone. Melilla was really fascinating to me. I visited there several times, and it's almost entirely an enclave occupied by people who are in the military. And that was really, I didn't know that prior to being there. Ceuta has a lot more of a mixed population of Spanish and like Moroccan folks. And people around there have a special passport where they can cross easily back and forth, although that's really been changing in the last few years. So there's a lot of trade that happens because those two enclaves are free trade zones. So a lot of people are bringing goods back and forth, sometimes illegally, right under the noses of border guards, and usually it's tolerated and sometimes it's not. So yeah, I have a friend, Lorena Gazzotti, that I work with who does extensive research on those zones. And so I would point you more to her work on what those look like.
Yeah, can I just follow up on both Vishu's question and what you just said right now? I was curious about within this liminal position that Morocco seems to hold, how migrants from Morocco themselves, as they arrive in Spain, like what is their relationship to the EU and to Africa, and how are they also placed in a very liminal space as they're racialized through both Africanity, but also religion, and how, like, I'm curious how this relationships between the quote unquote African migrants who are coming from the sub-Saharan region, but also the Moroccans as they are both in Europe. Maybe you've had some of these conversations, how that's playing out, because I would see like something, some things carrying over or some not necessarily
I mean, I think it's all over the place. I guess I would like to say like the conditions of possibility for solidarity are there, but also there's a lot of anti-Blackness, or like, I mean, I would also say like Grace, for example, is post Libya is anti-Arab, you know, and she identifies everyone in North Africa as uniformly Arab and very much racializes them, violent and dangerous, you know, those sorts of things. So, but, and I have, in another thing I've written, I have like this extensive story from this dark-skinned Moroccan man who basically gets into it with another Moroccan woman in a cab over the position of migrants on the street. And he comes in their defense based on like a common humanity is what he says, and like an African solidarity. And she says, oh, you're just taking their side because you're Black. So, and she had previously lived in Europe, and he was like, well, how are you even being like that? Like this, you're treating them just like they treat us in Europe. So I think like that's an open question. I think people are still like navigating that. I do know that there are a lot of really amazing transnational like human rights activists work and things like that that are uniting around sort of this post-colonial and broadly African idea about like sort of just the ongoing coloniality of Europe, right? And pushing against that. But I would say that's usually younger folks and usually like a little bit more educated folks, but not completely. So.
Yeah. Thank you. I have a question here from Alexis Essie, and she asks, I have a question about how Black/West African women and men relate to one another in Morocco. Professor Gross-Wyrtzen discussed the ways in which Black male and female migrants experience racism and discrimination differently, and that many African migrant men come without families of women and children. So now I'm wondering, did you notice any sense of kinship, solidarity, or unified action between African men and women facing discrimination in Morocco?
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. I think the answer is yes. But again, it's complicated by the need to survive. And so So I think in general, like you have these really robust African community, like West and Central African communities in Morocco, but people are also like smuggling each other, trafficking each other, lending each other money, extorting each other's labor, including sex labor, you know, as a means of survival, right? But at the same time, like for example, with Grace and Lawrence, like I called her his wife. I called her his wife, but she says she's not his wife, right? And they're in a relationship and raising this child, and in part because they need each other, and in part because I think there's like a real friendship and kinship and like and affection with each other. But like if things were different, if there were different choices, more choices available, I don't think they would be together in that way, right? So yeah, so I think people enter into probably all of us enter into all kinds of complicated relationships based on the constraints that we have. And intimacy, I think, is something that is really, I think the border is laden with intimacies, right? Like, and some of those are sort of uneasy or exploitative intimacies, but some are like beautiful and genuine intimacies. And I think our Ngo, who's clearly being smuggled by Lawrence, exemplifies that because he loves them, you know, and is really has a deep affection for that whole family. So
I think we're right at time. And I think that was a great note to end on. So thank you all for joining us today. And so be ready for the book coming out. I'm sure I'll be buying. I'm sure I'll be buying it. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, and Dish has a
I'm scrambling to